All today, the construction giant Carrillion has announced it's going into liquidation. It comes after talks between the firm, its lenders and the government failed to reach a deal to save the company. But what next for the almost 20,000 employees the firm has in the UK and for all the services they're currently providing? Carrillion is a construction and facilities contractor, which the government pays around £1.7 billion a year for a wide range of provisions. For example, the firm is the second biggest supplier of maintenance services for Network Rail. It maintains 50,000 homes for the Ministry of Defence, and it manages part of the contract for HS2. The firm's debt pile of roughly £900 million, that's excluding hundreds of millions on a pensions deficit, stems partly from three major public-private projects: building the Midland Metropolitan Hospital in Birmingham, the Royal Liverpool University Hospital and the new Aberdeen bypass. The government's facing questions about why it contracted Carrillion for more services after the firm posted the first of several profit warnings last July. Even after the share price plummeted, the government awarded Carrillion part of a contract with two other companies to work on HS2, a contract worth £1.4 billion. The government also granted the firm further contracts to work on military sites and railway lines, collectively worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Despite crunch talks to save Carrillion from going under, it announced today it didn't have the financial backing to continue operations. Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington said the firm's staff would continue to be paid and that services would continue to be provided either in-house or by alternative contractors. Well, earlier, the Cabinet Office Minister, David Lidington, was asked why the government had continued to award contracts to Carrillion even after the company issued profit warnings.
Each department operated on the basis of the publicly known legal rules that govern the award of government contracts, and in the way that I've just described, if you look at those central government contracts that were agreed, which involved Carrillion post July 2017, you'll see that they had joint venture partners who are there to take up the slack, and so that risk was covered.
David Lidington. Well, to get the latest on this, we're joined by our business correspondent, Jamie Robertson. Jamie, first of all, you've heard David Lidington there. He said that Carillion's debts came primarily from the non-public side. Is that correct?
Yes, it seems to be at the moment. A lot of the debt was involved in actually a lot of the public projects, but actually where the problem comes, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the company having debt, but a lot of the problems come from the fact that they weren't getting the payments were being delayed on many of their foreign contracts, particularly in the Middle East, it appears, at the moment. And so they have a cash flow problem where they cannot actually finance their debt. And then the banks said that they asked the banks for an extra £300 million, and the banks basically have said no, and that's why we find ourselves in the situations we're in at the moment.
So if the government had refused further contracts back in July when the first profit warnings were posted, what would have been the outcome in your view?
Well, I think then the crisis would have happened even earlier. One of the problems you're faced with is when you have a profit warning, how do you get out of it? Well, one of the best ways, of course, is to have new contracts, new profitable contracts, which are going to give you better cash flow, which are going to give you some way of financing your debt. If you don't get those new contracts, well, it'll become more difficult for you to be able to finance those projects, that debt. So, in a way, the fact that they were getting new contracts was a way of helping them, but it simply wasn't enough. The black hole, as it were, in terms of trying to finance that debt was too big.
The government is saying, the number 10 spokesperson this morning has said that contingency measures were put in place once that first profit warning was released. And I take your point saying that actually what they needed were new contracts to keep afloat. But clearly the contingency measures that the government said were in place failed. Yes,
but it's not so much for contingency measures in terms of actually keeping those projects going have failed. We'll have to see now how effective they are at actually picking up the cycle, picking up the collapsed contracts, how the government can pick them up and how the private sector can pick them up. The real danger I think we're going to find here is what the kind of hiatus that occurs between these contracts ceasing, as it were, now, and being taken over either by the public sector or by the private sector. And what happens to those subcontractors, the people who are contracted to do much of this work? Will they get paid on time? Will they get paid at all? And I think that is where the problems, we simply don't know how big a problem it's going to be. But we're talking about here, I think it's a supply chain which is worth something like £3 billion a year in terms of contracts, both here in the UK and abroad. And for some of these companies who are providing services to Carrillion, being paid on time becomes extremely important. And if you have a hiatus, if you have a delay which goes on for several months, you'll see some of these companies getting into real problems.
Jamie Robertson, thank you very much. Well, we're joined to discuss this by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable. On that one point, before I go to Anne-Marie Trevelyan, £3 billion in that supply chain. What is going to happen to all those companies while they wait to see what happens?
Well, the optimistic outcome is the government takes some of these contracts in-house, retenders, the workforce is kept together. I think quite a lot of the highly skilled people are certainly going to be saved, but there is potentially massive disruption. I mean, I think one of the things we ought to be looking at, the government ought to be looking at, we've got the British Business Bank. You remember we set this up in coalition. It's there to provide flows of credit for small business, and trying to put in place supply chain finance is something the government could and should be doing. Right,
but is there going to be a significant cost to the taxpayer while this process is going on?
Well, there is going to be a significant cost to the taxpayer, not least because the taxpayer has taken on the Pension Protection Fund liabilities, which are massive. We're talking 600, 800 million. The pensioners themselves will take a cut from that, but the government's on the hook. I mean, what is so absolutely galling and is going to anger people so much is the taxpayer is going to finish up paying a substantial bill for this collapse, while at the same time, I think the hedge funds have pocketed 300 million, effectively gambling against government decisions. The chief executive of the company, whose misjudgments caused all of this, pocketed, was it 6 million in bonuses, still being paid a full salary. I mean, that's the kind of injustice that does get people very angry about the way that these public sector contracts are let.
Right, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, are you angry about the fact that the taxpayer is going to shoulder the burden for what's gone wrong here?
I think the challenge we've got, and Vince raised the point, that we have the pension protection scheme to ensure that when a private company does fall over, we can protect pensions. That's really important. I think the challenge we've got, and what concerns me, and I've had constituents who run, subcontracting firms over the weekend who do construction particularly, that we make sure exactly, as Vince says, that cash flow doesn't mean that those who are working for Carrillion directly, those jobs will be secure. And we must make sure, and the government is working incredibly hard to actually look at that bigger picture, understand what the official receiver will need in terms of practical support to ensure that those contracts can be rolled out, and also that jobs are not at risk further down the scale.
So you'll be looking for guarantees, will you, from the government on that?
It's a matter the government has said this morning that they will do everything to support the official receiver with the government contracts that are in place, so those will continue. As Vince says, there will be disruption, I'm sure, but those projects are still needed, and those jobs will be supported and financed accordingly. And we'll be paying, as we were paying Carrillion before. The official receiver will now be the person who the government is dealing with to make sure that those.
What do you say to those employees whose pensions are going to be cut?
That is one of the great frustrations when a private sector company does fail. But the fact that there is a pension protection scheme does mean that 85% of the pension is protected. It's one of the great frustrations. That's something the Prime Minister has talked about so much when she wants to make sure that that business works well, and that shareholders are empowered to actually stand up to directors when they're making poor decisions for their employees and their shareholders.
Right. So should the government have continued to grant contracts, quite a significant number of contracts, to Carrillion after its first profit warning in July?
Well, as your business correspondent said, and as someone who worked in the finance sector all her life before becoming an MP, the challenge of a business that's there's an enormous business where cash flow becomes a problem for some reason, and I think some of the Middle Eastern contracts seem to have been the cause of it. Continuing to work your way through that can often work, and you bring in new contracts, you're providing a good service. But I think the government did make sure that its contingency framework was in place, because contracts brought up since that point last summer have been in joint venture arrangements, so that the risk is very much mitigated.
Right. Well, that's the government's justification. And we heard also from our business correspondent saying that actually by providing more contracts to Carrillion last July, it did actually keep the company going. It would have just collapsed earlier.
Well, I don't really buy that. You asked whether Anne-Marie was angry. I'm angry on behalf of the taxpayer, and also on behalf of the 20,000 people up and down the country whose jobs are at risk, including 400 in Wolverhampton at the HQ. And as you know, I'm a Wolverhampton MP. I think there are serious questions that need answers about why they were granting more contracts when in July there was the profit warning. But also, the government has a right to appoint a Crown representative to monitor what's going on in companies such as these. This is a company that has over 450 government projects. It's a huge company, and we're now seeing the result, unfortunately, not only of incompetence of the company itself, but incompetence of the government in the way that they've handled these contracts.
Do you accept, though, that some of these employees could have lost their jobs earlier if, in fact, Carrillion had collapsed back in July after that first and second profit warning?
Well, who's to know exactly what was going to happen and what could have happened? But why didn't the government have a better grip of what was happening within the company after the profit warning? They could have appointed this Crown representative that they have every right to do. As far as I'm aware, they did not.
No,
so they should have known more than they did, or they did know more and they're not telling us. So we need an investigation into what they did know.
Should those contingency measures, which is what I asked Vince Cable, should they have been more robust? Because it was clear that the company was struggling. And was it correct to award the large number of contracts post that profit warning?
Well, I think the government's been clear, and obviously David Linden this morning and Chris Grayling over the weekend have set out very clearly that those contracts that have come in since those profit warnings were in joint venture arrangements. Therefore, the risk was mitigated in that framework, and that's something that I have no doubt the government, working with the official receiver, move forwards will make sure that those contracts can roll out in a new format. But there will be disruption, and that is very frustrating for everyone, and particularly for those for whom there is a lack of certainty in the weeks ahead.
Well, let's have a look at the sort of broad philosophy, the arrangement of these public-private sort of contracts, if you like. I mean, is it correct now, should the government continue to award these sorts of contracts to companies like Carrillion?
Well, they can do a certain amount in-house and probably should do. I suspect that the outsourcing revolution has gone too far, and as a result we're getting into situations of this kind. But when the government can't even do its tendering properly, it's difficult to imagine that it can actually run these companies properly. So we are going to have a relationship with the private sector. There are many very good private companies that didn't have the kind of extreme leverage that Carrillion had. And the government is going to have to work out an arrangement with them. I think the basic principles have got to be that we can't have a situation where companies make profits in good time and offload the losses when they fail. We can't have companies that are too big to fail. Those are the basic principles. Tendering probably should operate much more on the principle of allowing in directly a lot of the smaller subcontractors, so we're not over-dependent on big tier one companies of this kind.
Right, although that was the case during the coalition government too. I mean, Carrillion won part of a total of 4.5 billion. Right, but you think it now should be reduced. Do you agree? Jeremy Corbyn says it's unsustainable, that there should not be big private companies like Carrillion awarded these sorts of contracts. Should all of these be brought in-house? Should they be publicly run?
I think there is a question as to whether all of them should be brought back, but I think we certainly should review quite how many are tendered out, and we have to look at how this is done. I have reservations about, for example, Vince was talking earlier about the level of remuneration that was granted to the upper echelons of this company at a time when it was in dire straits, and it's actually the lower paid people down the chain who are going to suffer. And yet, you know, the former chief executive who presided over this mismanagement was given a 1.5 million payout, and then there was even more on top of that. So there are big questions to answer as to what exactly is taxpayers' money going to? Is it going into remuneration for the chief executives, but then we're not seeing the services provided?
Right. Should some of that salary package be clawed back from Richard Howson at Carrillion? £660,000 salary paid over 12 months, £28,000 of benefits, and even more money into his pension.
Well, I think this is the question that the Prime Minister has raised many times, which is that question of those huge salaries, you know.
Should he have been paid it, though, Anne-Marie Treadley?
Well, if the shareholders are agreeing their remuneration committee within the private, you know, sector framework that we have and the laws that exist at the moment, that is an acceptable thing for companies to do. But I think the question of whether that is enough and whether shareholders feel they have enough, you know, robustness to stand up and disagree with that if they feel they're not getting the right job. If someone is doing a great job for a huge organisation, running a really complex set of projects,
sure,
they're well remunerated, I have no problem
with that. But if they've gone bust, should he still continue, in your mind, can you justify it to your constituents that Richard Howson continues to get that money now the firm's gone bust?
Well, he won't now that it's gone bust, because all bets will be off. And the official receiver will be dealing with that.
Well, he's receiving 12 months' pay. Should he get all that money?
Well, it's a matter of whether he will if he's no longer on the payroll. That's a question for the official receiver to identify.
What do you think?
Well, honestly, I think that people shouldn't be rewarded for failure. But the contract that he will have set up when he joined, however many years it was before, is one that they have to honour at the time. The question is whether the shareholder empowerment is strong enough, and that's something the Prime Minister continues to look at.
Is that correct? Or should his bonuses that have already been paid be clawed back, Vince
I would
Cable?
hope so, yes. There is complicated legal issues around how the official
Sure.
receiver... But in principle, it's an absolute outrage that you have rewards for failure in this way. And it sends a terrible example to the business community.
Right.
It's taxpayers' money, you know.
So
this money is taxpayers' money. They do obviously have other contracts elsewhere.
So let's go back to whether all public-private contracts should be brought back in-house. You've said some. You disagree, then, with the Labour leadership, your party's leadership, that actually they should come to an end, those public-private contracts?
I don't know whether the government has capacity to provide all of the services that are you know, currently contracted out. But I agree with Jeremy Corbyn. At the moment, what we're doing is we are taking the risk from the public sector and we're putting it into the private sector. And there are some of these companies who are taking on this risk and see what happens in the case of Carrillion. That's not the case for every company that's taking on contracts from the government. But yes, I do think this needs looking at, and I do think that the taxpayer should be rightly angry about what's happened in this case. Right,
because, of course, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, there were a significant number of private finance initiatives,
for example. But it's how you award these contracts, isn't it? And it's who you award these contracts to.
Do you think it should all be reviewed and actually many more of these contracts should be brought back in-house?
No, I think that, you know, the governance needs to be robust, and in all these contracts, you know, they were huge, these huge complex contracts. The reality is that government has proven itself over decades never to be the best organisation to run these things. Getting the specialists...
So what's your solution?
Well, having the private sector lead on those, you know, is a good relationship where it works. I think the question here of whether the risk management within the company and the directorship failed to actually do what needed in what is an enormously complex organisation is one that we need to think about as government and make sure that the governance arrangements and the directors are held to account early on so that these sorts of risk failures can't happen. But that is a cash flow question, and it's one that, you know, we see often. It's just that in this instance it's a company that has collected over many years an enormous number of government contracts as part of its cash flow.
Vince Cable, thank you very much. Now, it's time for our daily quiz, and the